Now, as a fighter, Steve McQueen, now he is good in that department because that son of a gun got the toughness in.
People think they know the Steve McQueen story. The troubled kid who became Hollywood's biggest rebel. The guy who drove fast cars, dated beautiful women, and lived life entirely on his own terms. But here's the part that almost nobody talks about. When Steve McQueen closed his eyes for the last time in November 1980, he left behind something so carefully hidden, so quietly constructed over decades, that his own family didn't fully understand what they had inherited. What started as rumors about a dusty barn in New Mexico eventually revealed a fortune that would grow into hundreds of millions of dollars. And the people who received that inheritance? They became some of the wealthiest heirs in Hollywood history, without ever making a single movie themselves. The story of how that happened is stranger than any film McQueen ever made. It involves secret deals, hidden collections, a will that cut out the people closest to him, and a licensing empire that nobody saw coming. It also involves a mystery that still hasn't been fully solved, a locked vault that insiders say contains something capable of rewriting parts of his legacy forever. Buckle up, because this is the real Steve McQueen story. And it is far more fascinating than the Hollywood version. To understand how McQueen built his fortune, you have to understand where he came from, because the way he grew up shaped every financial decision he ever made. Steve McQueen was born in Beech Grove, Indiana, in 1930. His father abandoned the family before Steve could form a single memory of him. His mother, Julia, was young, unstable, and frequently absent. She left Steve with her parents for long stretches, and when she did come back, she often brought men into his life who were violent and unpredictable. By the time Steve was a teenager, he had already learned one of the most important lessons of his life. The only person you can truly rely on is yourself. At 14, after a series of petty crimes and run-ins with the law, McQueen was sent to Boys Republic, a reform school in Chino, California. Most people who knew him from that period said he was angry, guarded, and deeply suspicious of anyone who tried to get close to him. But Boys Republic also gave him something he had never had before: structure, discipline, and a sense of community. McQueen would later return to Boys Republic multiple times throughout his life as a donor and mentor, calling it the place that gave him a second chance. That connection tells you something important about who he was underneath the tough exterior. After leaving Boys Republic, McQueen joined the United States Marine Corps. His military career was rocky, marked by conflicts with authority and at least one stint in the brig. But he completed his service, and the experience added a layer of grit and physical toughness to his personality that would later translate perfectly onto the screen. When McQueen eventually made his way to New York and stumbled into acting through a combination of luck and restless energy, he carried all of that hardship with him. It was not an act. The danger audiences sensed in him was real. McQueen's rise through Hollywood in the 1950s and early 1960s was not the clean, polished story of a studio discovering a diamond in the rough. It was messy and difficult, and fueled largely by McQueen's sheer refusal to be ignored. He studied at the Actors Studio in New York alongside people like Paul Newman and James Dean. He scraped together small television roles and theater work before landing his breakthrough with the television series Wanted, Dead or Alive. By the time The Magnificent Seven came out in 1960, audiences were paying attention. By the time The Great Escape came out in 1963, Steve McQueen was one of the most recognizable faces on the planet. What made McQueen different from other stars of his era was not just his looks or his talent. It was the way he understood instinctively what audiences wanted from him. He did not give long speeches or big emotional monologues. He communicated through silence, through movement, through the way he held himself in a room. Directors sometimes found this infuriating because it was difficult to direct someone who communicated so much without words. But audiences loved it. They trusted him in a way they rarely trusted actors who were more obviously performing. That trust translated into enormous box office power. And McQueen, who had grown up with nothing, was not about to let that power go to waste. By the late 1960s, he had begun negotiating deals that were almost unheard of for the time. For the Thomas Crown Affair in 1968, he demanded and received $750,000 upfront, a number that shocked even the most experienced producers in the business. For the Towering Inferno, he negotiated a back-end profit-sharing arrangement that ultimately earned him over $12 million. He also established a practice of charging studios $50,000 simply to read script. If he passed on the project, he kept the money anyway. Studios grumbled about it. They paid it anyway, because they knew his name on a poster was worth more than any marketing campaign they could run. But here is where the story gets genuinely interesting, and where most accounts of McQueen's life fall short. The money he made from films was only one part of what he was building. While the public saw a rebellious loner who spent his off-screen time racing motorcycles in the desert and wrenching on cars in his garage, what was actually happening behind the scenes was something far more calculated. McQueen was quietly constructing a private empire built on physical assets, strategic partnerships, and a brand identity so powerful that it would outlive him by decades. His collection of vehicles was the most visible part of this, though even that was largely hidden from public view during his lifetime. By the early 1970s, McQueen had accumulated more than 130 vintage motorcycles, including rare British, German, and American models that collectors were already hunting for. He favored Triumph, Husqvarna, and Indian motorcycles, many of which he had customized specifically for himself. These were not display pieces. McQueen stored them in temperature-controlled garages on remote properties in California and New Mexico, away from press cameras and public curiosity. His car collection was equally impressive. He owned nearly 60 high-end historic vehicles, including a 1963 Ferrari 250 GT Lusso, a Jaguar XKSS, and a Porsche 917K that is now considered one of the most iconic racing machines ever built. That Porsche alone eventually sold at auction for over $14 million. And then there was the Mustang, the 1968 Highland Green Fastback from Bullitt, the car that performed the most famous chase sequence in cinema history through the streets of San Francisco. When that vehicle finally sold at auction in 2020, it brought in $37 million. McQueen had not just driven those cars. He had understood long before anyone else did that objects connected to authentic human beings carry a kind of value that only grows with time. He also collected watches with the same quiet passion. His Rolex Submariner, a watch he wore frequently and simply stored away, later sold at auction for over $230,000. A Heuer Monaco that he wore during the filming of Le Mans sold for $2.2 million. These were not watches purchased as investments in the conventional sense. They were objects that McQueen chose because he genuinely loved them. But his instincts about quality and authenticity meant that every personal choice he made in private ended up being financially brilliant in the long run. McQueen's business arrangements were similarly shrewd, though almost none of them were publicly known during his lifetime. He had a significant stake in Honda's United States motorcycle marketing campaigns during a period when Honda was aggressively trying to expand its American market presence. McQueen's image was used to promote their bikes, and the results were dramatic. Sales climbed sharply, and the royalties that flowed back to McQueen were substantial. This was a branding partnership that predated the modern concept of celebrity endorsement deals by years, and McQueen had negotiated it quietly and personally, without any of the fanfare that typically surrounds such arrangements today. His involvement in off-road and desert racing was similarly layered. On the surface, it looked like a rich man indulging an expensive hobby. Underneath, McQueen had partial ownership interests in companies that manufactured and sold the gear, bikes, and equipment associated with that lifestyle. By simply being seen participating in desert racing, he was promoting products in which he had a financial stake, without ever needing to film a commercial or give an interview. His silence was not just a personality trait. It was a business strategy that would look remarkably sophisticated by any modern standard. He also secured early rights deals with companies like Tag Heuer and Triumph that, while modest in value at the time they were signed, gave his estate the legal foundation to capitalize on those partnerships long after his death. McQueen seemed to understand something that very few celebrities of his era grasped, that the rights to your own name, face, and image are among the most valuable things you will ever own. He worked with attorneys to ensure that those rights were properly documented and protected. That foresight would prove to be worth tens of millions of dollars to the people who inherited his estate. When McQueen died on November 7, 1980, in Juarez, Mexico, the official story that circulated in the press was one of tragedy and financial ruin. He had been diagnosed with mesothelioma, a rare and aggressive form of cancer caused by asbestos exposure, likely stemming from his years working with asbestos-lined racing suits and possibly from his time in the Marines. Unwilling to accept the prognosis offered by American doctors, McQueen had traveled to a clinic in Mexico to pursue an unconventional treatment involving Laetrile, a substance derived from apricot pits that had been banned in the United States. He did not survive the surgery. The press immediately began reporting that McQueen had died nearly broke. Cancer treatments, legal bills, and what appeared to be modest estate filings gave that impression credibility. The initial probate valuation of his estate came in at roughly $2 million, a figure that seemed to confirm the narrative. For someone who had earned millions per film and commanded astronomical fees simply for reading scripts, $2 million sounded like the sad ending of a story about a man who had lived too hard and saved too little. What those early reports completely missed was that the $2 million figure only counted the most obvious and liquid assets. It did not include the hundreds of motorcycles and vintage cars stored on remote properties. It did not account for the royalty streams still flowing from his films. It did not capture the image licensing rights that were dormant but legally secured. And it did not reflect the hidden partnerships, the real estate holdings across 3 states, or the carefully negotiated profit-sharing arrangements buried in old movie contracts. The full picture of what McQueen had built would not become clear for years, and in some cases, for decades. The will that McQueen had written in January 1979, just under 2 years before his death, was itself a document full of surprises. He named his 2 children from his first marriage, Chad and Terry McQueen, as the primary heirs to his estate. His first wife, Neil Adams, who by most accounts had played a significant role in supporting and guiding McQueen during the early and most difficult years of his career, was completely excluded from the will. She received nothing, no money, no property, no formal acknowledgement of what she had contributed. It was an omission that Neil would speak about publicly for years afterward, describing with visible pain the experience of being erased from a story she had helped write. Barbara Minty, who had been McQueen's partner and was reportedly planning to marry him at the time of his death, received some personal belongings, clothing, letters, memorabilia, but no significant financial share of the estate. Given the closeness of their relationship in his final years, many people close to McQueen found this surprising. The will also contained a legal clause explicitly excluding any unknown or future children from making claims against the estate. This was not an accidental omission. It was a deliberate legal barricade, inserted because McQueen and his attorneys were aware that paternity claims were possible and wanted to foreclose them entirely. Those concerns were well-founded. Not long after McQueen's death, a woman filed a lawsuit claiming that her son was Steve's biological child. The court dismissed the case for lack of sufficient evidence. But McQueen's own lawyer later acknowledged that 2 additional paternity claims had been handled privately, never reaching the courts and never resulting in any disclosed financial settlements. The existence of those quiet resolutions speaks to just how carefully McQueen's legal team had anticipated and prepared for disputes over his estate. The true scale of what had been left behind began to reveal itself slowly, in stages, over the years following McQueen's death. One of the most dramatic moments came in 2006, when estate managers opened a storage barn on a remote property in New Mexico that had not been touched since McQueen's passing. What they found inside has since become one of the most talked-about discoveries in Hollywood history. Dozens of motorcycles in various states of preservation, stacks of racing helmets, worn leather jackets, original film scripts covered in McQueen's handwritten notes, race gear with his name stitched into the lining, and personal items that had never been cataloged or documented. Experts brought in to assess the contents estimated the total value at over $30 million. The barn had simply been sitting there, accumulating worth, for more than 25 years. That discovery fundamentally changed the conversation about McQueen's legacy and his financial intelligence. Prior to 2006, the conventional wisdom had been that his estate was relatively modest. Some residual film earnings, a piece of property here and there, nothing that suggested serious long-term planning. The barn revealed that the conventional wisdom was wrong. McQueen had not accumulated those objects randomly or carelessly. He had been building a physical archive of his own life and times, storing it in places where it would be safe, private, and hidden from the public eye. Whether he fully intended it as a financial legacy, or whether the financial dimension was a secondary consequence of his personal passions, is impossible to know for certain. What is undeniable is the result. The watches that emerged from private safes and vaults told a similar story. The Heuer Monaco that sold for over $2 million. The Rolex Submariner that exceeded $200,000 at auction. The Persol sunglasses that fetched $70,000 simply because Steve McQueen had worn them. Every personal object that came out of McQueen's private storage carried with it an almost mystical premium that went far beyond the intrinsic value of the item itself. Buyers were not purchasing a watch or a jacket or a pair of sunglasses. They were purchasing a piece of authenticated reality, a tangible connection to someone whose life had taken on the quality of legend. The licensing empire that grew from McQueen's estate in the decades after his death is one of the most remarkable stories in the history of celebrity branding. It did not happen all at once. It built gradually through the 1990s and accelerated dramatically through the 2000s and beyond, driven by a combination of careful management, growing nostalgia for the aesthetics of his era, and an almost perfect alignment between McQueen's personal style and values that became highly commercially desirable. The British clothing company Barbour used a single photograph of McQueen wearing one of their waxed cotton jackets to anchor a global marketing campaign. The impact was extraordinary. That one image, reproduced across billboards, magazines, and eventually digital platforms, generated a campaign reportedly worth around $40 million and transformed how a generation of consumers thought about the brand. McQueen was not alive to approve it or collect a direct fee. His estate was, and the terms under which that image could be used had been carefully negotiated, ensuring that the financial benefit flowed directly to his heirs. Tag Heuer rebuilt much of its brand identity around the Monaco watch that McQueen had worn in Le Mans. The relaunch of that timepiece centered entirely on archival footage and photographs of McQueen wearing it during filming, pushed sales to record highs, and turned the Monaco into one of the most recognizable luxury watches in the world. Ford revived the Bullitt Mustang multiple times, releasing special edition models that sold out quickly and commanded significant premiums in the secondary market. Porsche collaborated with the estate in 2024 to produce a limited edition tribute vehicle that sold out immediately, with collectors paying well above the listed price simply for the connection to McQueen's racing legacy. The organization managing these licensing relationships, Greenlight Licensing Group, operated as a careful gatekeeper, approving only deals that reflected McQueen's authentic image and rejecting arrangements that